exchange at the Australian Agricultural Company settlement Port Stephens from 1826 to 1833. Over to you, Eleanor.
All right, great. Thank you. I'll just try and share my screen.
Turn the volume up. We can see that you're not on mute.
All right.
Can't hear you.
Me? Can you hear me? Can't hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, and is my screen sharing?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So I will get started then. So thanks very much for having me. My name is Eleanor, and today I'll be speaking about material culture and exchange at the early Australian Agricultural Company settlement in Port Stephens from 1826 to 1833. So for a bit of background, I first started to research this topic about 3 years ago when I wrote my honours thesis on 19th century interactions with.
Hang on there, Eleanor.
Okay.
I think we're having internal room issues, so
Okay, no worries.
usually the other way around. Okay, try again.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. So I'm Eleanor, and I'm speaking about material culture and exchange at the early AA Coast settlement in Port Stephens from 1826 to 1833. So for some background, I first started to research this topic about 3 years ago when I wrote my honours thesis on 19th century interactions with Aboriginal material culture in the Hunter region. I pursued a material approach to regional history that sought to uncover the way objects and cross-cultural exchange mediated the hunters' early colonial relationships. This was part of an ARC project titled Mobilising Aboriginal Objects, Indigenous History in International Museums, which aimed to build knowledge about exceptional but poorly documented Aboriginal objects from Sydney and the New South Wales coast. This research coincided with an increased interest in colonial era Aboriginal artefacts and their place outside the country. A landmark book drawing together this important work is Ancestors, Artifacts, Empire, Indigenous Australia in British and Irish museums. So why material culture and why exchange? Well, a steady stream of artifacts left the country from the first decades of colonial occupation in what the Mitchell librarian Richard Neville calls a rage for curiosity, as cross-cultural exchange became ingrained in early settlement. This has been explored in the context of Port Jackson and King George's Sound through the work of scholars like Grace Karskens and Tiffany Shellam, and the Hunter region and Port Stephens AA co-settlement was no different. As the archaeologist and ethnohistorian Isabel McBride identified several decades ago, the, I quote, exchange or trade of goods, commodities, and services is a neglected facet of contact history, end quote. A focus on exchange helps to draw attention to the inequalities as well as the affordances of any given relationship. There can be mutuality and reciprocity at one instance or period of time, but this could quickly change. The anthropologist Arjuna Padarai reminds us of, I quote, the constant tension that not all parties have the same interests in any specific regime of value, nor are the interests of any two parties in any given exchange identical. The Hunter region has also been somewhat neglected. While it has been the subject of rich scholarly analysis, it can be overlooked as a significant site in the history of colonial New South Wales and its cross-cultural relations. As historians Nancy Cushing and Julie McIntyre have pointed out, the area, I quote, once loomed large in the fortunes of the colony, but has had low visibility in new histories of empire and nation. So in this presentation, I'll be drawing these ideas together to explore material culture and cross-cultural exchange in the founding years of the Australian Agricultural Company, as illustrated in the writing
Funny,
of
the
two
sneakers
of
are
its.
brand new, never been worn. I would have thought, yeah.
Sorry. Are we okay there?
Yeah, it was going well. Don't know. Yeah, keep going. Ellen.
Okay. Yeah, I just heard something there and I wasn't sure.
Ghosts.
Yeah, we might just remind everyone to put themselves on mute on stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be drawing these ideas together to explore material culture and exchange in the early years of the company settlement, as illustrated in the writings of two of its early protagonists, Robert Dawson, the company's first manager, active between 1826 and 1828, and Isabella Parry, wife of Commissioner Edward Parry, who lived in Port Stephens from 1829 to 1833. Both Dawson and Parry produced vivid accounts of their time in New South Wales. They provide insight into the prominent role material culture and exchange played in the Carrington settlement and its interactions with Worimi, Wonnarua, and Awabakal people on whose lands it occupied. Dawson's 1830 publication, The Present State of Australia, would be well known to many of you. He writes in a style that is reminiscent of colonial exploration narratives, blending the identity of an ethnographer and a diplomat while conforming to the conventions of 19th century travel writing. He wished to be seen as someone with authentic knowledge of Aboriginal people in their country, claiming in the early pages of his account that I have seen more of them than any other European has done, end quote. Isabella Parry wrote for a more select audience. She penned a diary and sent numerous letters to her family, the Stanleys of Alderley Park in Cheshire, that are today held in the archive of the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge. The Stanleys were a large, well-connected family belonging to the upper echelons of imperial society. Parry's diary was transcribed by Jean Easthope, and a copy is held at the Special Collections Library at the University of Newcastle. It is the hundreds of pages of letters that she sent her family, which are not publicly accessible, that I think are especially revealing. They show her deep curiosity in the natural and material world she encountered in Port Stephens, as well as the complex and often contradictory attitudes she felt towards its inhabitants. In 1824, the Australian Agricultural Company was founded by an Act of British Parliament and granted 1 million acres in New South Wales for the cultivation of pastoral land. Dawson was its first manager, and he decided on the harbour around Port Stephens as its first permanent establishment. When Dawson arrived in the colony and began to chart a route from Newcastle to Port Stephens, he followed a usual formula of British intercultural diplomacy. At the suggestion of the pilot who he was travelling with, he abducted an Aboriginal man he named Ben, along with his wife. He wrote, I quote, "The black man whom we had thus caught was our only guide, and it was with much reluctance that he consented to act in that capacity," end quote. The invaluable role of Aboriginal people as guides for Europeans is illuminated in this map. While you can't quite tell from the image, there are several Aboriginal place names that demonstrate a reliance on Aboriginal labour and knowledge. During the journey from Newcastle to Port Stephens, the group came across a schooner that Dawson had sent from Sydney, and he went on board to order, I quote, "a tomahawk and a suit of slop clothes, which I had promised to my friend Ben," end quote. Articles of trade had accompanied successive voyages intended to facilitate first contact between Europeans and Aboriginal people. Dawson wrote that Ben was pleased with his new belongings and, taking in the view, I quote, "declared that all the harbour and country adjoining belonged to him," end quote. He recorded that Ben then spoke about being born there, that the land belonged to him, and said, I quote, "I give it to you," end quote. Following this encounter, he wrote, I quote, "We shook hands in ratification of the friendly treaty," end quote. While Dawson may have understood this transaction to be symbolic of the 1 million acres already granted to the company by the Crown, this encounter illuminates the inequalities that can manifest in any given exchange. Dawson rendered this friendly treaty in a narrative formula recognizable to his readership. Through the act of naming Ben and then dressing him and shaking hands, he illuminates the political dynamics of colonial exchange relations. As the Carrington settlement developed, Dawson admitted, I quote, "The assistance I derived from Aboriginal people, whether as guides or labourers, exceeded anything I can describe, with groups supporting me greatly through fishing, carrying water, collecting and chopping firewood, and building bark huts. These bark huts may have looked something like that you can see in this image here, sketched by Isabella Parry. In exchange for these services, Aboriginal people received a range of European goods, including food, clothing, and other materials agreed to by the individuals in question. This economy was sustained through mutual reciprocity and revolved around small-scale tasks that created a constant cycle of employment and exchange. Cross-cultural transactions in Carrington also extended to friendships and caring roles, with Dawson describing Worimi children caring for settler children, Worimi children playing with their white counterparts, and Worimi men working alongside white men with, I quote, as much cordiality as if they had been of the same colour and nation, end quote. Dawson noted that the most sought-after European materials among the Worimi were steel fishhooks and hatchets. He records many instances of gifting these, and I've always wondered whether company hatchets may have turned up anywhere in archaeological digs, and how many hatchets the company provided Dawson prior to his arrival in New South Wales. If anyone knows, please pass it on, because that would be really interesting. So Dawson recalled that Ben, his initial prisoner and guide, would visit Carrington when he ran out of, I quote, iron fishing hooks, which the natives prepared to their own, and was sure to wait upon me with pearl fishing hooks, which I received as curiosities, end quote. Aboriginal women were responsible for making fish hooks and their woven bark lines, as well as for fishing itself, but it was men who conducted the object exchange with settlers. And these fish hooks probably looked something like this. While fishhooks made from shell were vital tools that provided sustenance to Aboriginal people as well as the newcomers, the arrival of steel hooks introduced new categories of value. Shell hooks became objects of European curiosity rather than solely objects of labour. They were laden with value in the eyes of settlers like Dawson, and acquired status as signifiers of authentic Aboriginal practices. Through the act of European collecting, they satisfied the colonial rage for curiosity. So a particular brand of colonial curiosity, which meshed fascination with the local environment and its people with a fair amount of condescension and paternalism, was also a motivating factor in Isabella Parry's exchanges with Aboriginal people. Over her 4 years in Port Stephens, she packaged numerous parcels of stuffed birds, seeds, and Aboriginal artefacts to send to her family. Here on the right of this slide, you can see a contents list penned by Edward Parry that includes the various articles of natural history and material culture the couple posted to England. 8 artefacts that were sent by Parry to her family are today in the British Museum and were donated by the Parry's grandson in 1926. These include a shield, 4 fishhooks that you saw on the previous slide, and 3 fishing spears attributed to New South Wales. I'll be visiting Port Stephens later this month to learn from community members about how they understand these collections today. As Parry does not detail the circumstances in which she acquired artefacts, it's difficult to state with certainty where and from whom they were collected. However, as Dawson's reflections indicate, fishhooks were common exchange items in the company settlement. Fishing was also a key part of Worimi life, and indeed life for all coastal Aboriginal people. Parry constantly recalled to her family how the Worimi were dressed and what tools they carried, and she sketched some of the contents of the first package she sent to her family in this middle image here, and took care to emphasize the pronunciation of the weapons. The language she uses to describe her collections uncertainty about how the artifacts will be received by her family, as well as anxiety that their value and curiosity be appreciated. She told her mother, I quote, "I've been very busy today making up the different parcels to go in our box, and I think you'll be rather amused at the queer collection of articles, some of which certainly are scarcely worth sending, except that in England, anything from New South Wales acquires value," end quote. Her ambivalence about the beauty of the material was qualified by acknowledgement that, I quote, "their fishhooks and nets are curious and will have an interest in the Australian shelf," end quote. Sadly, the whereabouts of these nets and the objects pictured here in the middle is currently unknown. They weren't donated to the British Museum as far as we can tell, and the Alderley Park estate was auctioned off in 1932. This auction included 2 weapons, as well as various native curios and implements. This doesn't really help us to understand whether this material was from Australia, however, as many members of the Stanley family travelled through and made collections across the British Empire. So, where instances of cross-cultural exchange with the Warramai do feature in Isabella Parry's writings, it's commonly with reference to clothing. And some articles can be seen here in this Augustus Earl painting from 1826. Parry notes that while Warramai women generally avoided her, they occasionally requested European clothing to be worn by them and their children. Parry was herself a new mother, having given birth to twins at Government House in Sydney in 1829, and leveraged this position when telling her sister, I quote, "The other day, 2 women came up to me with a child and begged me to give them a cap or frock like one of my children," end quote. Parry also references the act of dressing an Aboriginal child named Hannah. Hannah was just 4 years old and was a playmate of the Parry twins. She was a daughter of Mile Tom, who appears in Dawson's account as a black constable. Hannah attended the school for company children that Isabella had helped to establish. She wrote, I quote, "Hannah went to school very regularly, as long as her clothes lasted, but when the little jacket which Crowther, the Parry's nurse, had made her was worn out, she would not go, being ashamed of her native dress amongst the other children. She is to be washed and dressed tomorrow in Alethia's tunic," end quote. This tunic was a gift from Parry's sister in England. When the Parry family received a package of clothes from Alethea, a dress that was too small for the Parry twins was given to Hannah. Isabella wrote that she, I quote, "expects Hannah's native companions will be quite jealous and beg for a blue tunic," end quote. References to Hannah sadly drop off in Parry's writings after 1832, with Isabella's last mention being, I quote, "Little Hannah that had Aunt Alethea's dress is a naughty girl and has been away from school," end quote. These references to Hannah and her relationship to European dress reveal the standards of colonial morality that were prevalent in the company settlement. While Parry is fascinated by what she calls native dress and the traditional weapons and material culture of the Warramai, she nevertheless imposes European standards of clothing on children as the requisite for accessing the colonial education system. When Hannah ceased to attend the Carrington School, it is possible she was seeking to distance herself from the settlement in order to remain connected with kin and community. As I hope these snippets have revealed, material culture and exchange were key facilitators of cross-cultural interaction in the early years of the Australian Agricultural Company. Objects played an important role in diplomatic relations, however unequal, and goods and labour were exchanged as part of the everyday functioning of the Carrington settlement. Like in many colonial locales, Aboriginal artefacts were desired by settlers for their status as curiosities in Western exchange networks. Clothing also served as a measure of colonial decency, desired by Aboriginal people as well as imposed on them by settlers' moral standards. The accounts of Dawson and Parry provide insight in the materiality of cross-cultural exchange in Port Stephens and enrich our understanding of social life in the company. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Eleanor. Any questions? Comments?
I've got a question. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead,
so-
go ahead.
Eleanor, that was terrific. One of my questions is, what do we learn from other cultures where there's been colonial interaction and presumably been studied widely? Is there a consistency or is there specificity with each of these cultures?
Sure. So I think a common example that is looked at is from Richard White, who wrote The Middle Ground with reference to Indigenous cultures of North America. And so the kinds of relationships that happened in these early contact areas where things like seal skins and like furs were traded between settlers and Indigenous people. And I think when people have looked at this in the Australian context, the thing about a middle ground is that it has to be kind of reciprocal and there has to be values and kind of an equality between the cultures that make them kind of mutually dependent on each other. And when people have looked at this in the Australian context, they say there can be very short periods of this kind of relationship. For example, I think Robert Dawson's like 2 years with the company is a good example of that. But once the Parrys got there and relationships changed, so it's very short-lived. And I think anytime people have applied this to colonial Australia, it's only been for very short periods of time.
Eleanor, I just wanted to say thanks. I found it really fascinating, and I particularly enjoyed hearing the story of little Hannah and how clothing actually affected her and her showing up for school. And that's something that still kind of even rings true with children today, right? When they see themselves different as other children at school. So I just found that really interesting and moving. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a really interesting case. The Parrys, they also reference other settler families they know that have adopted Aboriginal children from other parts of Australia and have been raising them, but references really drop off. It also reminds me of Jane Franklin in Tasmania. They adopted a little girl called Mathena, and there's an article about Mathena because she, passed away once the John and Jane Franklin went back to England, kind of in obscurity. And Gay Sculthorpe actually found that Mathena's little doll is in a museum in England. So it's just like one of these really, really tragic stories of like children, being taken and stuff like that. Obviously, still has a lot of resonances today.
Eleanor, we've got a couple of comments. That's fascinating. Thank you from Shelley, and Talia Bundy Collis says, thank you so much for sharing. Very interesting. Such a shame these items cannot be now located. I have hope they will eventually be returned to country. Jude asks, Eleanor, what drew you to the hunter?
Yeah, great question. I think when I started to be involved in that ARC project, looking at Sydney region artifacts, I wanted to kind of extend that because often people have, people like Grace Karskens and Maria Nugent, they've looked at the relationships in early Sydney. But like one of the first places to have cross-cultural contact outside of Sydney was the Hunter area. And the Hunter also just has this incredibly rich visual archive that really drew me to it. You have the Scatoe manuscript. I think that's how you say it. I've only ever read it. I've actually never heard how you say it out loud. And a lot of, you've got Augustus Earle's paintings, Joseph Lycett, and you have these early sources that really drew me to that, where you have a lot of references to Aboriginal material culture. So that's what drew me there.
Fabulous. Any other comments, questions? Look, thank you very much, Eleanor. Look, this is a topic which is interesting because we've recently had inquiries about, especially with regards to the Chicago exhibition, because we've had some material from here end up in various collections in America, later than your period, but still this idea of transferring Aboriginal artifacts to America. So watch this space. There might be some cross-collaboratory, if that's a word, because we've got people interested in where these things ended up. And to answer that question, where they've ended up, I mean, we might find them in the course of doing that type of research. So anyway, thank you very much for being there. And for people who want to know more, Eleanor's done a post for the Hunter Living Histories. Amir, our conservator, Dr. Amir Mogadam, asks if you've got an article on this or if you just got the post that you did for us.
Yeah, so I have an article specifically on Isabella Parry in Australian historical studies as well. So that's, you can
send us the link. We'll send it
yeah, I'll do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Another round of applause for Eleanor.
Thank you.
Okay, our next presentation is on Newcastle's historic shipwreck archaeology with Dr. James Hunter, who is Curator of Naval Heritage and Archaeology at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Sydney. So James has been up here because he's been involved in the latest Stories About Town film, along with Glenn, who I'll just make them a tag team at the moment. So when James is done, Glenn can give us an update on the film. over to you, James. Oh, hang on. More technical issues. All right.
Wouldn't be a seminar without them,
Okay,
right?
thanks for all your patience. What's it doing?
There you go. So just.
Okay, yeah, cool.
Is it working now?
Yes, we're good.
Fantastic. Okay.
Nobody breathe. Okay, we'll be all right. Well, hello, everyone. Yep, I'm James Hunter. I work at the National Maritime Museum. I'm a maritime archaeologist by profession. Been doing that about almost 30 years now, which is kind of crazy to think. Started my career in the US. I gathered my accent, not from around here. But came to Australia almost 15 years ago now. Got my PhD. Love this country and decided you people are going to have to put up with me, ones who are not. So, yeah, started working at the National Maritime Museum in 2015. Kind of been involved with all sorts of stuff there. But in doing some research related to other shipwreck projects, I started finding out more and more about shipwrecks in Newcastle and kind of realized, wow, there's a lot of stuff up here. So yeah, that's kind of why I'm here today. Talk to you guys a little bit about the potential for shipwreck archaeology up here. There's a lot here, probably more than you realized, definitely more than I would have thought. And I guess really, if we want to get down to it, why is that? Well, the answer is quite simple. Because the Hunter, or the Coal River, as it was known back then, is treacherous. It is a tough place to get in and out of historically, particularly for sail-driven vessels. It was just a dangerous, dangerous entrance for the river. And that's why you had a lot of ships piled up there. And if you couple that with Stockton Beach, which I have read a quote that says it is, quote, the most dangerous part of the Australian coast to approach in an easterly or southeasterly gale, that just adds to the issue because, well, we get a few of those from time to time around here. What really kind of blows my mind, though, is the sheer number of shipwrecks we have here. The earliest recorded wreck is the Norfolk in 1800. Now, that Norfolk, for those of you who may not know, is the same one that Flinders and Bass used to circumnavigate Tasmania. It was the one that they realized Tasmania was an island, separate from the rest of the continent. So that humble little vessel had been built in Norfolk Island of Norfolk pine. So it is actually one of the earliest examples of an Australian-built watercraft with Australian indigenous timber. So quite significant for a lot of different reasons. That vessel was seized by some convicts in the mouth of the Hawkesbury, none of whom apparently knew how to actually navigate or sail a vessel. They got as far as Newcastle and piled it in right on what's now called Pirates Point. And today that name still sticks. So that wreck is there somewhere. Nobody knows where. Nobody's found it. I would love to. I think that'd be great. So stay tuned. But if we're looking at vessel numbers, this is an interesting fun fact. So between 1800 and 1977, if you count the area from the north breakwater of the river up Stockton Beach, there has been at least one vessel loss per decade in that span of time. So, 177 years, we have had nearly 300 shipwrecks. That's a lot. And we're talking all types of vessels: sloops, schooners, ships, steam vessels, sail-driven vessels, motor vessels. You've got World War II landing craft and tanks and all this stuff. It's all out there. Now, I want to try to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So this graphic shows the roughly 3 square kilometer area that runs from the North Breakwater up Stockton Beach. That's about 3 square kilometers. So there are roughly anywhere between 200 and 300 shipwrecks in that small area. Okay, now, let me put this in perspective. I started my career in Pensacola Bay, Florida. Okay. Now, Pensacola Bay, this is the entire Pensacola Bay system. It is massive. The date of European shipwrecks goes back 400 years. There were Spanish vessels operating there in the mid-16th century, and there are shipwrecks dating to that period. Now, there are approximately the same number of shipwrecks in that bay system, 300, give or take. That is the size of the area where the shipwrecks at Newcastle are concentrated. So you can understand there's a lot of wrecks in a very, very small area. And literally, as many of you know, the Stockton breakwater, they are right on top of each other. They are piled on top of each other in places. So this place is rife with shipwrecks, and it is exactly the kind of place I would like to work because I could do a lot of fun stuff here. So what I'm going to do now is talk about a couple case studies just to kind of give you an idea of what we have here and what could happen. And I'll start with a shipwreck that's known and one that's been found, and that's the Berbice. Now, I know many of you have probably seen on the Hunter Living Histories blog, for example, there have been posts about these shipwrecks covering and uncovering. And the Berbice is one that kind of popped out of the sand in 2021. So a little bit about this ship. So 717-ton ship launched in 1868 in Dumbarton, Scotland. It was a composite built vessel. So what that means, it had an iron frame with timber planking. Very common ship construction type of that period. First owner was John Kerr of Greenock, Scotland, and he continued to own that vessel until his death in 1872, and his son Robert inherited the company and his vessel assets. Now, the reason it was called the Berbice was because the first voyage it made was to the West Indies, where there was a settlement in the West Indies called Berbice, and that's probably where the name came from. It's quite common for that to happen back then. But this ship, like many ships during that period, covered a lot of ground over the course of its life. So it sailed to India, the Dutch East Indies, or what we now know as Indonesia today, South Africa, the Caribbean, and South America. And ultimately, it also came to Australia. So, roughly 20 years later, it's still in operation, and it's bound from Melbourne to Newcastle in ballast. So it's going to pick up coal. A lot of ships tended to do that when they came here. Under the command of a gentleman named Alexander Ross, the coal was intended for San Diego, California, so it was going to come here, pick the coal up, head across the Pacific, San Diego, drop its cargo off there. Quite a common thing during that period. Now, as often happened with many ships that were lost around here, it was attempting to approach the Hunter River entrance during a full gale. Night of 4th June, 1888, fired distress signals, put up flares, shined blue lights, did a number of other things to try to get the attention of the signal station at Nobby's, and those signals went unheeded. So Ross, probably making one of the worst decisions of his life, decided, I'm going to try to make the entrance without a pilot. A lot of people made this mistake, and this is what often happened. So in this case, the vessel was trying to come through, didn't answer its helm as it came around Nobby's, and immediately was getting pushed towards the oyster bank. Dropped anchor, tried to hold its position, but basically dragged, hit the oyster bank, and bounced across that bank over towards the Stockton side. And as it went across the bank, and this is something I think is pretty telling for the oyster bank at Stockton Beach, it passed the wrecks of 3 other ships. I mean, you just watch them go by as you're just bouncing across, the bank and wondering what was going to happen to yourself. And this happened frequently. And in fact, many ships, when they hit the oyster bank, hit other shipwrecks. That's just how many there were. Just absolutely chockers of these things. So anyway, got across the bank, grounded on Stockton Beach, and ran aground. And this was pretty much the condition of the vessel within a day or two of it wrecking. Thankfully for the crew, they were saved by the rocket brigade, who were able to get out there and get a rocket to launch a line on and get a breeches buoy to bring the crew off. Now, for those of you who don't know what a breeches buoy is, I absolutely love this painting. This is by Winslow Homer. Kind of gives you an idea of what this apparatus was. You would take rockets with a line attached. They would fire those across to the ship. The crew would then make that line fast to the ship. The line would be tied off on the beach. And then you would have one of the life-saving guys go out on this sort of life ring with sort of a harness attached to it. And that's the breeches buoy part. And then they would put the crew in and take them across. And they would be kind of transiting back and forth, often in very treacherous conditions. And that's kind of what you see here, a very dramatic sort of depiction of one of these in use. But they got all the crew off. Everyone survived. That was the good news. But the Berbice itself was a complete loss. And there it sat. And like many shipwrecks tend to do, they become very popular attractions for the public. So people were just jamming onto ferries to come across from Newcastle to Stockton to see this shipwreck. And there's some absolutely fantastic photographs of this thing aground. Once, of course, you had a vessel like that aground, there wasn't much you could do. They weren't going to be able to get it back off. So ultimately, the vessel was salvaged for anything that was accessible. And then over time, it broke up. Many cases, people would come out and take the timber off the ship and just absolutely pillage it for anything and everything they could get off of it. But eventually, it succumbed to the elements, succumbed to people salvaging it, and it disappeared. And that is until 2021 when it popped up. And so this is the wreck. And in the background there is the Stockton Life Saving Club, just to give you an idea of where it is. So it's very close to shore. Of course, the beach has receded since the time of the vessel's loss, but it's there and it's pretty obvious what it is. Having seen many shipwrecks in my career, that is what they tend to look like. Particularly timber wrecks will get reduced down to just the very bottom of the hull. Everything above pretty much the sediment line disintegrates and disappears, and you end up with the bottom of the ship. And when it gets buried, it actually preserves incredibly well. So we often find on shipwrecks that get buried, we find organics, we find leather, we find bones, sometimes we find textiles. There's all sorts of material that gets trapped on these shipwrecks and gets preserved. So from an archaeological perspective, one of the things I find quite interesting about a wreck like this is the opportunity to look at the shipwreck itself and then look at the historical record and compare the two. And in the case of the Berbice, there's a lot out there, particularly with Lloyd's Register, because Lloyd's produced surveys for these ships when they were insured with Lloyd's. And these records tend to be fairly comprehensive. So in the case of the Berbice, the document you're looking at here is what's called the first survey. That is a survey where they went through, a surveyor or a team of surveyors went through the ship. They recorded the dimensions of the timbers, the iron framing components. Every nitpicky bit of information you can possibly think of was recorded in this first survey. And the great thing about that is when you have a data set that's that precise and that comprehensive, you can then compare that to what you're finding on the shipwreck site. And that in turn can help you positively identify it. Now, I have no reason to believe that wreck's not the Berbice. It's in the right place, it's the right distance offshore. But if you can find more information that just drives that identification further home, all the better. And the nice thing about that wreck is it's close to shore. It's in about 4 to 5 meters of water. So it's very shallow, easily accessible. And depending on the level of coverage or it not being covered, there's quite a lot there to document and record. The other nice thing about the Berbice is it had several surveys made of it over the course of its life. So, for example, instances of repair, modification, all of these things are recorded in the survey documents. So in the case of the Berbice, here's a bit of a weird one. There are these little holes in the bottom of the frames or the ribs in the bottom of the ship called limber holes. Now, what those did was they allowed the bilge water to flow through the bottom of the ship so it could go into the pump well and get pumped out of the ship. But they kept having problems with the bilge limber holes getting jammed full of crud, basically, every sort of debris you can think of. And so what they did to try to combat that problem was they put ceramic tubes through the limber holes and then they concreted them in place. So this is a really weird thing. It's kind of a weird adaptation and it is recorded. And I'll bet if you looked at that shipwreck, you'd probably find it. It would be right there. The other nice thing is they identify the timber species. So they did repairs to the ship at one point. And they were using very weird North and South American woods. So if you timber sampled the ship, and you ID'd them, and it turned out to be some weird American wood, you'd go, yep, that seems to be more evidence to identify the wreck. So there's all sorts of great things there that I think the Berbice would be a great case study to look at. And the other nice thing is we do often have plans. So in this case, this is a Berbice midship sectional plan. Just gives you an idea of the construction of the vessel. And if you can compare that data to what you're seeing on the wreck site, all the better. Now, that's an example of a wreck that's been found. I want to get into one that hasn't been found yet. And I think this one's a lot of fun. This wreck actually is what got me interested in looking at shipwrecks up here in Newcastle, and that's the Estremina. Now, the Estremina is interesting for two reasons. Well, it's interesting for a lot of reasons, but the two big reasons are that it was a Spanish-built vessel. And so when it wrecked here, that would make it one of only a very, very small number of vessels of Spanish origin shipwrecked in Australian waters. So that's a fantastic thing. The other thing that's even weirder and makes it even more wonderful is that it is the only historically documented victim of Australian piracy. So what happened? Let me get into that. So this vessel was built in what is now Ecuador. It was built in the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1803, and it was named the Extremeña at the time. And it was built as an armed schooner. And actually, the whole purpose of this vessel being built was to be a hydrographic vessel. It was a survey vessel. That's why they built it. That's what it was meant to do. It was not meant to be a warship. It was just meant to go out and do hydrographic surveys. The Spanish, even by the early 19th century, although they had been there for hundreds of years by this point, there were whole swathes of the entire Central and South American coast that were unsurveyed and undocumented. And the Spanish were suffering a lot of shipwrecks as a consequence to this. So they decided they needed to get out there, start mapping as much as they could, and try to prevent these calamities from happening. So the Estremina was part of that whole scheme. Joined the Guardia Costa, which is the Spanish Coast Guard, shortly after it was launched. Now, it was supposed to be armed with 12 guns, but it was only armed with 4. And in fact, those guns were down in the hold when it went on its hydrographic voyage. So first thing it did was to go on a hydrographic survey voyage with 2 other Spanish vessels. One was a brig. However, the brig had some issues with its masts, one of its masts. So it turned around and went back to Valparaiso in Chile. But the Estremina was told to continue on to a place called Copiapó Bay in Chile. And so there it was. Its crew was out surveying the coast and surveying the harbor. Along comes this brig out of nowhere and starts shooting at them. Now, Spain was not in a state of war with anyone at this point, so the crew understandably kind of panicked. They weren't prepared for this. The ship that was attacking them far outgunned them, had way more crew. So the captain of the vessel decided the best thing to do would be to just run it aground and set it on fire and burn it so that it wouldn't be captured. Now, what was the vessel that attacked it? Well, it's a brig called the Harrington. The Harrington was owned by a merchant named William Campbell, Sydney-based merchant, and the vessel was based in Sydney. Now, Campbell had done a lot of illegal trade with South America. He had done this in 1802 and 1803, and he was probably planning to do a bit more, but this was during the Napoleonic era. And there were some weird alliance shifting going on among different nations. And at this point, it was looking very much like the Spanish were going to join the French against the British. So Harrington saw this as an opportunity to capitalize. He expected war was imminent. He thought if he got on the South American coast and he was doing a little bit of illegal trade and just happened to see some Spanish vessels while he was there, he might be able to capture them and bring them back and declare them as prizes. So that was the whole rationale for this. So they sailed in, they attacked the Estremina, the crew, they ran the ship ashore, the crew got off, they set it on fire, and then the Harrington crew came in, put the fire out, and took the Estremina, and away they sailed into the Pacific. Got to Tahiti. Campbell comes off the vessel, goes on shore, and says, well, what news of the war between Spain and Britain? Locals go, there is no war between Spain and Britain. What are you talking about? And at that point, Harrington, its crew, and its captain are in a heap of trouble at this point because what they have done is illegal. So, I don't know. If it had been me at this point, I probably would have just taken Estremina out somewhere, pulled the plug and sank it. But no. Campbell decides he's going to come back to Australia. So he's got the Estremina and he's got another Spanish merchant vessel that he's captured on the South American coast. Estremina gets hidden down at Jervis Bay with a prize crew while Campbell makes his way to Sydney. By the time he gets to Sydney, the governor of New South Wales, Philip Gidley King, is already aware of what has happened. And so he pretty much incarcerates him the second year on shore. Then finds out the Ethnomenia is down in Jervis Bay, sends another vessel down there. They come in, say, hey, surrender. Ethnomenia's crew goes, nope, not a chance, tries to leave the bay, gets fired upon, and then they strike their colors and surrender. So the vessel's brought back to Sydney. So the fun thing is, these are some Spanish documents that I found in Madrid. I was over there last year with the Defense Archives, and it is fantastic because they detail this entire engagement that happens on the South American coast. And in almost every instance, the Harrington and Campbell are referred to as pirata, the pirates. The Spanish were not happy about this. They were infuriated, in fact. And so at one point, it kind of looked like this little incident was going to be the thing that tipped Spain and Britain into war with one another. And King went through a lot of different things to try to please the Viceroy of Peru and smooth things over, including sending an emissary to South America with basically a letter of apology. Well, that vessel never made it. And so the Spanish viceroy didn't get an apology and didn't get anything, in fact, and was even more infuriated and wrote a very sternly worded letter to King to the effect of, I want my ship back, or I want the value of my ship in money as soon as possible. So King was trying to work out what to do about all this. And then, lo and behold, Spain and Britain go to war. And that just kind of resolves the entire issue at that point. And King makes the decision at that point to acquire the vessel for the colonial government in New South Wales. And so that's what they do. And strangely, they paid money for it. Now, the way this worked was they had put the money down as a surety, basically a bond for the vessel that was going to go, if the vessel didn't go back to Peru, the money would, but then war was declared. And at that point, the government just took the money back, said, well, we got that and the ship. Fantastic. Life's good for us. So at that point, the vessel starts doing a lot of, basic moving people, moving equipment, moving goods, mostly up and down the New South Wales coast. It did, however, help evacuate the last of the convicts from Norfolk Island down to Tasmania in 1814. And prior to that, had a bit part in the Rum Rebellion as well. And that it was the only government vessel in the harbor at the time this occurred. So the captain of the vessel was ordered to lower Bligh's pennant from his mainmast, which he kind of got in trouble for, but then it was all explained and he was forgiven. But the other sort of fun side note to this was when the mutineers were looking to get rid of Bligh as quickly as possible, they considered sending him out on the Ethnomenia to wherever, just to get him out of there. They were going to put him on this little schooner and send him off. And Bligh obviously balked that entire plan, and that didn't end up happening. But anyway, for a number of years, it did a lot of, most of the work that it did was between Sydney and Newcastle and up and down the coast. But January of 1816, it comes up to Newcastle, picks up a cargo of coal and timber, which it was going to then take down to Sydney, and attempting to get out of the river. It was running on an ebb tide, and the vessel started to lose control, and they put some anchors out to try to hold position. But guess what? Onto the oyster bank, as so many ships did. And in a very, very short amount of time, the vessel started to break up. And so the crew abandoned it. Nobody died on the vessel, but it was a complete loss. And in fact, one of the last historic mentions of the wrecked vessel is that it had sunk in the sand up to its weather deck. Now, for an archaeologist, that's very exciting because that's a lot of preserved hull to potentially look at. But anyway, there it was. Now, we have the good fortune in that there is this brilliant chart that was done in 1816. So the very same year that Ethnomenia wrecked at the entrance to the river by a guy named Jeffreys. He's a Royal Navy lieutenant and surveyor. And So here's a close-up of that same chart. You can see Stockton there up in the top right, and you've got Newcastle there to the left-hand side. And the fun bit is what's circled here. HMC schooner Estremina lost 1816. People in my business love things like this because they tell you where the wrecks are, and that really reduces your search time. So I was absolutely overjoyed to find this. And but I also know that the entrance to the river has changed quite substantially since 1816. And for one thing, somebody went out and put a big old breakwater through there. Now, this is not a GIS overlay. This is a quick and dirty overlay I did. I've spoken to people about doing a GIS overlay, professionals actually, and they have told me that there are apparently not enough landmarks on the Jeffries chart that align with the modern landscape to do it. But very roughly, this is where I think the Estremina would be relative to the modern breakwater. So this has got it plotted just on the inside. My preference would be that it would be on the outside, going more towards Stockton, because I think the preservation would be a lot better on that side. But again, this is a bit hypothetical. So it could be on the north side, it could be on the south side, or it could be laying smack dab under that breakwater. Don't really know. This is the joy of maritime archaeology. You know, it's you never know what you're going to get until you go out and start looking. But the nice thing is we have an opportunity there, I think. Uh-oh. The computer has stopped.
Well, we should, maybe get to another.
Yep, no problem. Oh, there we go. Okay, real quick. Yep.
Okay.
So I'll wrap this up. Anyway, basically, I think the point here is that, there is a lot in terms of maritime archaeological potential in Newcastle for historic shipwrecks, particularly. It's a massive, massive amount to look at. A lot of myriad studies could come out of it. I think would be worth pursuing. And we're just at the beginning of that. So I'd like to come back up here and do some work if y'all would like to see that happen. Thanks.
Just to dovetail quickly in, there's been a film, if people are interested in everything that James has been talking about, there's a film that's just been released in the last few days, made by this chap here, whose name is Glenn, but he also goes by the name of Chit Chat on Loop and Stab and Glenn from Waratah. And would you like to say a few words? It's now.
Right now. Well, hello everyone. I love being here. We just put out our 20th film with Stories of Our Town. This has been an amazing collaboration between, these two people here in particular, Anne and John, have just done so much work to make these films happen, and the university and the archives, but also the library in town and the museum. And now we've seemed to have found a lovely new friend in James, who, when I approached Peter Hobbins from the Maritime Museum about being involved with this, he said, I've got someone you need to meet, and James was it. And he told me that story he just told you about the Estremina. We are looking for that ship, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we put out the shipwreck film. This is our 20th film. It's already overtaken half a dozen of our other films that have been out for years. It's the uptake of this film. It's been wonderful. After 3 days, I think it's at 17,000 views, but it will probably end up at 50,000 views down the track. People are loving it, and people are loving it internationally because this story, we think of it as a Newcastle story, but the people that died on these shipwrecks were from all over the world. And part of the story is that, the people saving them from the Victoria Lifeboat, the Rocket Brigade, are getting medals from the Spanish government and from the American president. We were the 5th biggest port in the world in an age where there were 100 ships at a time in this harbour. And as James has pointed out, the draw was here, but it was also so treacherous. That's why there's so many wrecks. So we have a special story that we've told here, and thank God we found James, because the perspective that you brought just elevated it to another level. And I'm looking forward to finding the Estremina, because
Yes.
we had that story he told about the Estremina, and we tried to put it into the film, but unfortunately James is such a great storyteller, it was too big to fit in the film. So we've ended up going, okay, James has been up here. We went out and saw some jazz at the Grand Hotel the other night and we hatched a plan. So we're going to put this Estramina story out. That'll come out for December. One of the reasons that'll come out is because the National Maritime Museum is going to take our film, the shipwreck film, put it on permanent display, and then we're going to have a big Q&A down there and play the film. And so we'll play the Estramina, and we've also had a bunch of local divers that have come forward and saying they want to help, they want to jump in the harbour. Not me. I'm not particularly going to jump in the harbour, but Tony, who we make the films with, will be getting in the water with you, and we're going to find it. And so next time, hopefully, we meet, we'll have a better story to tell about this. So thanks for watching the films, and thanks to Anne and John for all the great work. Well, the university in general.
And y'all don't mind if I dig the breakwater up, right? Like through the gap in there.
It's not doing any other purpose.
No, just
May I ask, how helpful are the new drones today in finding these things?
Well, the Babees is a great story. So, they literally, a guy was flying his drone, just getting people surfing, and he found the Babees. I mean, it's crazy that footage is only like 5 years old or less than that. Yeah. And one of the divers that's in the shipwreck film, he teaches this method of how to measure a ship, and he saw it on the NBN News and saw this footage and said, that looks like a shipwreck. Went and dived it, swam it, measured it, and he was within 30 centimetres of what the actual size. So the drone footage is amazing. And during the course of making the film, there's endless amounts of drone. There's a great shipwreck in Swansea Channel that we knew it was there, but the day we went and filmed it, it's amazing footage of this full shipwreck. You could almost swim out to it from the Swansea head side, come out to it. So drones have made a huge difference. You might be able to add to that.
Oh, yeah.
But for us filming it, it was incredible because it was amazing.
No, you can hang all kinds of things off of them now. So,
well, the big development is underwater drones. That's the next thing. So there's ships that are at the 90, was it 60 metres or 40 metres? What's the lowest you can dive to with normal tanks?
no, I mean 40 to 50. You're pushing it.
So we know there's wrecks at the 100 metre, 99 metre. So if we can get access to a drone, we can go and find these wrecks that are straight off the shore because there's so many wrecks, and that's very, very exciting.
Yep.
And having a national interest from the National Maritime Museum is wonderful for us locally.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, look, the film is, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, where can you watch it? John?
I was just going to say, if you want to watch it, you can watch it through their YouTube channel for free.
Yeah.
And it looks great on a smart TV. So if you can get the YouTube channel through your smart TV, the underwater footage is fantastic, and they've managed to tell so many wonderful stories. Bill Hillier, fantastic storyteller. So
Robert Watson,
is he here? He's online. There he is. Right, from the start.
Is amazing.
So it's a cast of
Stories of Our Town is
a cast of tens.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's great. All right, so we have more. We have an exhibition.
So I just want to add to James. In 1888, there was no signal station on Nobbies. It was still at Fort Scratchley.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah.
But there was a rocket brigade.
Yeah, but they were right next door.
Yeah, they were in front of it. Yeah, they were.
History, right. Okay, right.
Good to know.
Okay, more Sydney visitors. We have our unrolled exhibition of the Hunter's Forgotten Maps, and to open it, we have Emeritus Professor Robert Clancy, AM, up from Sydney, along with his wife, and our friend Emeritus Professor Marie Gleeson, who helped us make the connections because when we were thinking of someone to open, we thought that we needed someone who had a fantastic experience in maps.
Yeah.
So Marie docked him in, and we managed to get him up. So while he's here, in half an hour, we'll all descend downstairs, the ones who are physically here. And the ones that are online, I'm sorry, you'll have to pretend or have a look at the website, take you through the high resolution scans. But Professor Clancy will be speaking on antique maps, senescence, or opportunity. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Over to you.
Do you want me just to
that'd be great.
Yes.
Well, look, thank you so much for having Christine and me here. we spent 30 years in Newcastle, 30 great years. Our kids grew up here. We enjoyed it immensely, and it's a wonderful town. And one of the biggest decisions we ever had to make was when I retired from the university, was whether we stayed here or went back to Sydney. And we went back to Sydney because of a whole range of issues. So to come back here, it's a trip through time. And the university's changed. Everything seems to have changed, except Marie, who was my friend until she put me in to come today. Anne asked me if I'd give a short talk on map collecting, and I'm not sure how to give a short talk on map collecting because it's such an incredibly interesting pastime, but I'll have a go. And what I thought I'd do is talk about how maps have been collected and the sort of dilemma that exists today, because to be interested in maps and collecting maps, you have to be very adaptable because the circumstances and conditions change. And I thought I'd look briefly over the time that Christine and I have been interested in collecting maps and show how these have changed and how they can be adapted, because the question really is, as the topic of this, is map collecting obsolete? Has it gone for a whole variety of reasons, or are there opportunities? Now, if you look at collectibles of maps, until about 1900, people didn't collect maps, they collected atlases. And I'm not sure if I got the... I've sort of put prices here simply to give you an idea of how adaptation is required, because the prices have changed a bit. If you wanted to buy a John Speed Atlas in 1900, now a John Speed Atlas contains all the county maps of England. It was an atlas of the world. He published his great atlas in 1626. You could buy it for the sum total of $6 or £3. £3. Now, I looked up one that was sold recently in England, and it was $80,000. Now, you might say, well, that's because values change. But in fact, great things of importance disappear, they go to institutions and off the market, and so they're increasingly at a greater rate. And if you look at the increase in the Speed Atlas compared with the English pound, the English pound value has increased by 150-fold. The Speed Atlas has increased at 13,000-fold. So that gives you a very good idea of, and that's pretty much what has happened in the antique world. But it's the high quality, rare, interesting, important, relevant issues that do this. So if we go back to maps, then maps were collected as books until pretty much World War I, when a crazy guy called Thule appeared, and he started doing something pretty terrible. He started getting these atlases at cheap prices and breaking them up into maps. And it's a terrible thing to think that anyone can destroy a book. I personally couldn't do that. But having that, what it did, it made available these extraordinary sheets of maps to people who wanted to collect them. Now, these are works of art. For example, if there's a copper plate engraving from 1620 from a Dutch map showing the beginnings of discovery of Australia, then that is a copper plate engraving. There's the most prolific, say Blau, who was the most prolific of producers, may produce from one copper plate up to 2,000 presses. Now, the great majority of those have disappeared. Very few of them are left. They're all hand-coloured. Maps were hand-coloured until about 1850. And so they're works of art as well as documents of history. But to me, they're very much documents of history. And when you collect things, you collect them because you think like a stamp collector. You want to fill all those little holes in a page, which I would consider incredibly boring. To me, they tell a story. So maps to me tell a story. And so what we find with map collecting is in the second half of the 20th century, there were shops everywhere. Thule had discovered this concept, and people were breaking up these wonderful old atlases. The English, old English families had to sell them because they couldn't afford, with death duties, it created a lot on the market. And it was a very exciting time to start collecting early maps of Australia, which was when I started getting interested. And as an actor, there are very few advantages of being an academic. Although being at Newcastle, there were many, but there are very few. You certainly don't get paid brilliantly. You don't get a lot of things that people in private have, but you travel and you have the opportunity of meeting people internationally. And so Marie and I were consigned to have to travel to tell people our stories, which we tried to do. But whenever I travelled, there'd be a map shop, and it was all part of the excitement. Then came 2000 when shops disappeared and the internet arrived. And so the whole sale of these maps moved to the internet. There are now probably no more than half a dozen map shops in the world today. There are very, very few because everything is done on the net. Even the map shops sell most of their material through the internet. So the dealer contact, which was part of the fun, because you learn about maps from the dealers. There was very little other way. There were not a lot of books. I wrote a book called The Mapping of Terra Australis, not because I wanted to write a book on the mapping of Terra Australis, but I wanted to put down on paper what I was looking for when I started collecting maps of Australia. And so that book was simply what I wanted to find out about maps. And it made me learn. Most things you do in life, you do to educate yourself. And that's certainly what I did. Now, next slide, please. I just want to run through how things have changed and the importance of adapting. Now, I'm not into prices, but I just want to give you a couple of examples of maps that we had in our collection. Now, this is a map that I bought for 700 francs, $200. Now, that was back in about 1990, and that was a lot of money, a huge amount of money. I was at an international conference. This is why every map is personal. There's a story about every map, every object you buy. And the whole aim is to beat the dealer. And people like myself had to beat the dealer because the prices were starting to go up. Now, this is an incredibly important map. It's the map by Thevenot. It followed quickly after Tasman. It was the first single sheet map of Australia. Everyone who has a collection of maps would love to have a Thevenot. I was walking up Rue de Seine to go to the cocktail party to meet my wife for the International Immunology Conference in Paris. And as a map collector, I'd pop into every little shop that was selling maps or books, say Carte de l'Australie, and French is my second language. And avez-vous Carte de l'Australie? And this guy looked at me and suddenly laughed and said, yes, I happen to have a Thevenot. And I couldn't believe it. He said, I said, no, I can't afford a Thevenot. He said, what do you want? I said, the map. He said, I'll take it out. I said, no. So I cut the thing out of this incredible book. And I said, how much? He said, it'll be 700 francs. Now, that was $200, which was a lot of money, but, not nearly as much as it is today, as you can see. This is now a $20,000 map. So I didn't have that sort of money. So I screamed up Rue de Seine, met my wife, and I think it was Andrew Kemp and a few of our other friends who were there. I said, look, can you quickly loan me some trousers for some money? So we're doing a cash around to see if I can raise 700 francs from my friends. This is true, isn't it, Christine? By the way, if you're a collector, always announce your new buys to your wife in public. It's self-preservation. Always announce in public. So I've got nothing to announce. I'm just announcing this in retrospect. So I built it down the Rue de Seine to pick up my Thevenot, which I rolled up and brought up. Now, this is a map now. There's no way on a university pension, where's the Vice-Chancellor, university pension, that I could even afford to look at a map like this. But it was a map I could just about afford a long time ago. So they're out of it. So let's go to the next one. Now, the next one, this has got a Newcastle attachment, and I put this in. This is the Matthew Flinders 1804 map of Tasmania. incredibly valuable. I just noticed there's an auction coming up week after next in Melbourne, and they've got a Matthew Flinders Atlas, which this came from, which is still in an atlas, and the estimate is $80,000. $80,000. I can't remember whether this is when we bought our house in Newcastle, Christine, was it dollars or pounds?
Dollars.
Okay, that should be a dollar sign. I didn't have, there's no way I had $3,000 to buy this wonderful Flinders Atlas that was being sold by Ken Hinch in Melbourne. But I had just been offered the job as the foundation chair of pathology in the new medical school, and I got this brilliant idea. And this is where you've got to be adapting. That if I was going to borrow money to buy a house, if I added $3,000 to the amount for the house, I could buy a Flinders Atlas. And I said to Christine, and you did say it was okay, darling, if
I don't think she's still okay.
No, I didn't have the job at this stage. I said, if I get offered the job and we have to buy a house, can I? Anyway, that's how we acquired a Matthew Flinders Atlas. Next slide, please. So very quickly, the question becomes, has map collecting had its day? And the answer is not at all. There's no way that maybe some people around this table could afford to pay $80,000 for a Flinders Atlas or $20,000 for a Thevenot map. But you have to think outside the square differently. Next. So what I want to do is just quickly talk about map collecting in 2024. You need to, if you want to collect anything, and I'm talking about maps here, you need to have a plan which is based on your interest and your budget. You've got to say, I love these old maps. This is an area I'm interested in, and I'm matching that to something that my budget can afford. You need to know your area because you've got to know more about this than anyone who's selling you a map. And if you do, you're going to get some terrifically good surprises. Now, I'm also interested in Antarctic maps. There are many areas where you can still buy maps, really interesting maps, important maps for under $100. But they're getting less and less, but they certainly exist. Some of them are 19th, 20th century maps of Australia, which I think is really going to be a very good area to be in because they're not always going to stay at a reasonably low price. Antarctica, for some strange reason, you can still get very important maps. Remember, the Antarctic maps cover a period from about 1870 to 1950. So you've got a period of discovery and development, which is in a more recent time frame. And thematic maps, there's a huge interest now in these maps which are more cartoony style. Actually, some of them are incredibly expensive, but a lot of them are not. And they're 1930s and 40s and 50s. So people are changing. And when I look at the quality of the reproduction maps in your exhibit, I think that's the way to go to start collecting maps. You know, have a friend who's got the capacity to make them. So listen, there are still local auctions, but the big problem with auction houses now, they're all on the web. Once an auction's on the web, a map that you think you'll buy for $50, some idiot in Yugoslavia is going to buy for $2,000 because you're up against the world. You're no longer one-to-one. And the idea is to identify your collecting on a one-to-one basis, and you'll do very well. eBay has extraordinary buys because people selling often have no idea what they're worth. Know more about it than the people selling. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put up a couple of maps that I just picked these up. Yeah, I did this yesterday, 3 days ago, and these are maps that are currently on available for sale. Now, the map on the left is a 1683 map by Mallow, who's a Dutch map maker. And these are amazing. They're not big maps, but they're very interesting maps of Australia. Are selling for around about the low $100. I saw one after this for $120. They're not that rare, but they're 1680. And then Antarctic maps. There are some great. This is a 1958 map. Sorry, it's not my photograph. I took it from the web, and it's a $50 map. So in Antarctica. And this is the time when Antarctica is undergoing great change and great interest. They're not going to stay at $50, but that's what they are now. Next slide, please. just to show you that this is not rare. These are really interesting maps. The 1870 map is a German map by Perthes, incredibly detailed. And you can imagine not much was known about Antarctica. And you can see that if you're interested in Antarctica, as I am, you can trace the whole evolution of Antarctica from those tiny little bits that were known because Captain Cook happened to run into the South Shetlands and see seals and sent the sealers from America down, and they just kept going down the Antarctic Peninsula, and the rest became history, and various other people found different parts of the western coast. But you can see it built up in these maps with great detail. The one on the right is around the time of the Antarctic Treaty. $40. I might buy that if you guys don't. But you can get these really important, interesting maps if you identify your area. Next slide, or that might be the last one. So all I've tried to do is give you, I kept my 10 minutes, guys. All I wanted to do was respond to your request to give a short talk on map collecting in 9.5 minutes and give you an idea of the excitement. And every map has got a story. You're out there, it's a bit of competition. You try to beat the dealer. A little hard these days with the internet, but you can still do it. But pick your area, pick your budget, and have a great time. So thanks very much.
Any questions for Professor Clancy?
Yes. Rob, regarding the book you have of Henry Dangar did on the Hunter Valley, it was published in, I think, 1828.
This one here. What?
That book that had.
The Dangar map.
Oh, this Dangar map here.
No, the other one. The other one that was on in the.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The Kerry Packer.
Oh, the Kerry Packer one.
Yeah. I know you own the book, but have you ever had the chance of buying the map that goes with the book?
You're talking about the
1828.
This was the one written by Dangar.
Yes.
Which has got the picture of the head. Yeah. No, I have not. I have not seen ever an original map. I've only seen 2 copies sold in the last 30, 40 years of that particular. It's very rare.
That map, yeah.
And that, not the book, of the book. And the book has not been associated, the map has not been with the book. I've got a copy of the book, but there was no map came with it. I saw a photograph, a reproduction of it only today. It's the first time I've seen that. It's by a very good, it was done by Dangar. And Dangar must have done 3 or 4 variations of the sightings he'd done for the AA company. He was quite an entrepreneur, Dangar. He got a street named after him. He was a member of the Australia Club, someone told me, but he was a wheeler dealer. And when he went out surveying, he'd survey for whoever he was working for, initially Mitchell and the New South Wales government, and then the AA company. But then he'd sort of go next door and survey a similar area for himself. So he was very wealthy. He had a very nice house in Milson's Point in Sydney, and made a lot of. I think he also was the first person from memory to actually try to. When the wool price dropped and they had all these sheep and there was no frozen meat industry, no one knew quite what to do with all these sheep, so they boiled them down to make candles. And Dangar got an alternate idea. He actually tried to put the meat into tins and sell them as tin meat off to England, but the Brits hated tin meat, apparently, and so it became someone else probably knows the story better than I do, but I probably haven't. The answer is no, I haven't.
No, you mentioned that you've only seen 2 books. Well, I got the other one.
Which one? The
Dangar book.
Oh, you got the other one?
Yes.
Did the map come with it?
No,
because I think I saw it on the market. Would you buy it in the last 20 years?
only about 4 years ago.
Yeah, I think I saw it somewhere.
From Berkelow's.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've got 3 copies of the book.
Tell me quietly later what you paid for it.
Well, but a dealer told me that he'd sold a copy of the map to Kerry Packer.
No, it's not true. I can tell you the true story. The true story is a map. It actually is not the map from the Dengar book. It was not sold by Bergelow. It was sold by a guy. He was a helicopter pilot for something that TV series who started selling maps in Sydney and had a very nice guy. And Melbourne. He had shops in Melbourne and Sydney, and I was working as a registrar.
In 5 minutes, we are having a launch on level 2 of our latest expedition.
Anyway, the bottom line is, it was bought by Kerry Packer's wife for him. I couldn't afford the map, so Kerry Packer's wife bought it, and it's a different map.
There you go. Okay, hold that. Now,
It hangs up in his pony place, up where he has his horses.
okay. Discuss more. Okay. Thank you. We have 5 minutes. 2 more stories quickly. Over to you.
Julie, would you like to zoom in and just tell us briefly about your latest book?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So basically, I've written another book on Newcastle in the 1800s. This is called From Penal Settlement to Coopolis. And basically, that was a term coined in the late 1800s to signify the importance of Newcastle, not only as a producer of coal, but also as a coal exporter. Now, I tried to find a point of difference from other books written on Newcastle in the 1800s. And so this is a chronological time frame of the built environment of Newcastle. And another differing point is that I've spent hours and hours going through Trove trying to find illustrations. So instead of it being illustrated primarily by photos, there's a large number of sketches, and I acknowledge the living histories for the images that I'm able to use. Very appreciative of that. And the book is available from Maclean's in Hamilton and from Marketown Nextra.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That's a reverse image of it, but you can also see Lycett's paintings on the cover.
Excellent. Now, that's a great segue to Lycett's play. We have Dr. Carl Caulfield, who will be launching a workshop, whatever it's called. What is it? A workshop play this Wednesday afternoon. You're all welcome to come along. Dr. Carl Caulfield, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me all?
Yes. Yeah.
Hopefully. I can just about see you through a glass darkly there. Well, just to update really, the presentation, we're looking forward to it. It's a work, I'm calling it a work presentation. It's a work in progress. It's gone through 4 drafts already, quite radical. So that's been me furiously rewriting. Oh, I seem to have. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Something dropped out then. I don't know if that was a statement or what.
Still hear you and see you.
Okay. Good. So the whole idea would be that we present it sort of with very simple costumes, and they're not necessary for any pedants. They're not going to be necessarily correct in terms of period. They're just what we could scrounge for the purposes of this presentation. It will be some simple props, and it'll be a work in progress. But I've been working with the actors. We've got 4 actors, and we've been working in the Brennan room and rehearsing here at my place. And we're confident that it'll be an exciting presentation. And then I imagine it's kind of to write a history play and to research and write it and get it into shape for full production in about 6 months would be, as you might imagine, quite unusual. But I'm certainly, I've found this process incredibly useful, particularly with all the support that I've received from people like Johnny and Anne and Paige and all the people that I consulted. So the process has been an exciting one. And please come along and have a look at the work in progress. And the whole idea is that I would then move it on maybe next year or the year after towards workshops and then moving into a full production. Clearly, if anybody knows anything about playwriting, it's taking place in the third dimension. You're looking at things on the rehearsal floor, you're spotting things that you can cut, but there's also that thing, sometimes it's been a process of spotting opportunities to extend scenes. And so it's kind of this plus and minus process where you're refining, you're taking out what you don't need, but you're also adding dramatic material, I suppose.
Thank you, Carl. We have 30 seconds. It's The Reformation of Joseph Lycett by Dr. Carl Caulfield, made possible by the Vera Deakin Regional History Fund as our first creative in residence. And it will be on Wednesday, the 6th of November at 4 p.m. at the Brennan Room. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're on downstairs, we're in exhibition launch. And the rest of the updates are on the Hunter Living History blog. There's plenty there, read at will, including blog posts on everything that we've discussed today. See you and thank you.